Dinner with Jesus, eating with people. We've been talking about it this whole series, and we've mentioned all different kinds of scenarios we find ourselves in when we eat with someone. I mean, sometimes eating someone can be really awkward, right? Like, I'm sure you've had your fair share of awkward meals. I have too. I mean, whether it's a first date or a last date, sometimes they're one and the same, right? A dinner where you're meeting like your significant other's parents, maybe for the first time, or as the parents, you're meeting your child's significant other for the first time. It just can be a little uncomfortable, a little awkward. When I think, though, of awkward meals I have had, some of the ones that just come right to the top of that list are the ones that I have had as a part of job interviews. Okay, and I know not all jobs work that way, but like I've worked for churches for a long time. And many churches, when you are applying, interviewing for the job, at some point in the process you meet with like a search committee made up of volunteers from the church. And there's usually like a formal interview time that you sit down around a table, but then there's also usually a time that you just kind of informally like have a meal together, and the goal there is just to see how you interact with people casually. I don't know if you've ever been some part of something like that, but let me tell you, it is incredibly awkward. There is nothing casual about it. You're trying to eat your meal, but you're also very aware that everyone else in the room is just scrutinizing and judging everything that you say and do. And like, if I needed proof, one of the guys at a church I worked at who was at my meal once told me, way after the fact, that he believed that, because he did this for his job, like he had these kind of meals with people all the time, and he believed that if a person salted their food before they tasted it, that was a red flag. And you shouldn't hire the person, because that meant, or it was supposed to mean, that they made decisions based on prejudiced assumptions, right? So you don't hire them. I mean, it's wild. And so it's crazy. You're trying to enjoy your meal and you can just feel the eyes of everyone at your table on you. We're in a series, as you know, called Dinner with Jesus, looking at different times Jesus ate with people in the Gospel according to Luke, one of the 4 biographies of Jesus in the Bible. And it's true, when you eat with someone, you get to know them a lot better. And even when we read about these meals that Jesus had with people and the conversations that surrounded them, we get to know Jesus a lot better. And we understand more about what it means to be his followers. Sometimes the meals that we read about with Jesus take a turn for the awkward. And this is one of those times, the meal in this story. The dinner we're going to read about is in Luke chapter 14. And it is at the home of Yet Another Pharisee. Okay, several times in this series, we have talked about Jesus having run-ins with the Pharisees. In that first century Jewish culture, Pharisees were conservative religious leaders and teachers of religious law. They loved rules. They were all about rules. And in fact, many of them basically taught and believed that God's love for you was based on how well you followed the rules. There are still people who kind of think that way. And not just God's rules either, like their rules that they used to interpret God's rules. They love to gatekeep. Like, you know what I mean by that? It's like the way some people do with their favorite band. Like you can say, yeah, I like that band. And they're like, oh yeah? Name 10 of their songs. And if you can't do that, well, then you're not a real fan. You're not worthy of their respect, right? The Pharisees used their rules to determine whether people were really right with God. Well, you're not keeping our rules. Well, you're not a real follower of God, right? And they had a lot of rules. Many of their rules had to do with keeping the Sabbath. Now, God said in the 10 Commandments, part of the important Jewish Old Testament law, to remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Okay, 6 days of the week were for work, but the 7th day was to be for rest and worship. Well, years later, eventually these Pharisees, these Jewish religious leaders, got very specific on how to apply that law. And they said there were a lot of things that you were not allowed to do on the Sabbath day, or it would be considered work. One of the things you were not allowed to do was to heal someone, to do the work of a doctor. But then Jesus comes along, and he miraculously heals people. And sometimes he does it on the Sabbath day. And this was one of many reasons. The Pharisees, a lot of them, did not like Jesus. And they thought that there was no way he could possibly actually be God's Messiah. Because how could someone who violated their Sabbath rules really be from God? So let's read Luke 14, starting with verse 1. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from abnormal swelling of his body. Okay, a couple of things we learn. First of all, this isn't just any Pharisee. It's a prominent Pharisee. It's a leader of the Pharisees who has Jesus over. And he has all his little Pharisee friends there with him. But he didn't have Jesus over just because he liked him or respected him or he wants to get to know him better. He's trying to trap Jesus. This dinner happens to be, what a coincidence, on a Sabbath day. And there is a guy at this dinner. Apparently there's a bunch of people there, but there's a guy at this dinner who is in need of some healing. He's experiencing some abnormal swelling. Other translations call it dropsy or edema. You medical people probably know all about that. Just a lot of swelling. These Pharisees are using this poor guy as a pawn. They don't care about him. They don't care very much about him at all. He's the bait. And they're watching Jesus closely just to see what he's going to do. If this happened today, they'd all have their phones and cameras out. I mean, they're just waiting for Jesus to say or do something that would discredit him so that they can then cancel him or worse. And then everyone would see that he really wasn't God's Messiah. But Jesus, he knows what's going on. And so Jesus deals with it this way. He actually has some questions for them. Verse 3, Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him on his way. Then he asked them, "If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out?" And they had nothing to say. As he always does, Jesus handles their scrutiny perfectly. First of all, he asks them, so is it okay to heal someone on the Sabbath day? Now, they thought they knew the answer, right? But they didn't want to be the bad guys. This is not about us, Jesus. This is about you. You're not going to catch us in a misquote. And they didn't want to be the ones who said, well, okay, even though you can heal this guy, you shouldn't because it's the Sabbath. And they probably didn't want to admit that they thought that Jesus had the power to heal him in the first place. So Jesus goes ahead and he heals the guy, which you'd think would indicate right there that he's from God. And then Jesus puts it back on the Pharisees. He's like, okay, are you really saying that it's not okay to help people who need help just because it's the Sabbath day? If your kid or your animal fell into the well on the Sabbath, wouldn't you get it out? It's the same thing. This Sabbath issue kept coming up in Jesus' ministry because he just didn't look at the Sabbath the same way the Pharisees did. On another occasion, he said this, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man," that's him, "is the Lord even of the Sabbath." In other words, he's saying, as the Messiah, I think I understand the purpose of the Sabbath better than you. And the point is not to oppress people with endless rules. And it's not to gatekeep based on your own rules who gets to be in and who's out. The Sabbath is there because we are created to need rest. And it helps us to refocus on God. That's why it's a command. See, we get into trouble when we start treating our rules as God's rules. Jesus at no point says or implies that the Sabbath wasn't important and that people shouldn't keep that commandment. But the way the Pharisees were applying that law was flawed. Jesus corrects them in a way that they can't really dispute. And so they have nothing to say. Their plan to trap him fails yet again. And then Jesus goes kind of on the offensive. He takes things in a different direction. It's kind of like he was saying, okay, since you're like all watching me so closely, let me tell you something I've observed here. Verse 7, when he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. Okay, before we dive into the parable, back in the day, at formal gatherings like this, they would typically arrange the tables like a big block letter U. Some weddings still kind of use this format. And so the host and the guest of honor, if there was one, they would sit there at the base of the U. And the more important you were, the closer you were seated to the host. There was a definite pecking order. Sometimes they even served better food and drinks to the people seated closest to the host than they did to the people down there at the end. So if you could get yourself seated close to the host, not only would you get better food and drink, but other people would be like, oh, that person, it must be a pretty big deal around here. It was sort of like a first century version of MySpace. Some of you remember this. You actually ranked your top 8 closest friends for the world to see. And if someone was on your top 8 and you weren't on theirs, oh, the drama. It was savage, the wild early days of social media. Or, if anyone played an instrument growing up, in band or orchestra, the best player at that instrument got what? First chair. The second best got the second chair, and on down the line. And I know that in some bands and orchestras, if you weren't happy with your position, you thought, I'm third chair, but I really should be second, you can actually challenge the person in the seat ahead of you, and you'd have this one-on-one battle royale between 2 clarinet players playing scales and stuff, and the winner would get the higher seat. There was a pecking order. So at this dinner, Jesus saw people jockeying for the best seats at the table. They were rushing to sit at the best seats. So they would be seen as more important. Remember, there were mostly religious leaders at this dinner, but they were all about status and significance. And so Jesus tells them a story. It's one of his favorite teaching techniques, a parable. Here it is. When you are invited to a wedding feast, don't sit in the seat of honor. What if someone who is more distinguished than you has also been invited? The host will come and say, give this person your seat. Then you will be embarrassed, and you'll have to take whatever seat is left at the foot of the table. That would be embarrassing, right? Not only are you not as big a deal as you apparently thought you were, but you're publicly demoted. But now you have to sit at the end of this U-shaped table. Hello, what's going on? What do you say? And the food, it starts at the base, and by the time it gets to you, they might be out of deviled eggs or whatever, and you're out of luck, right? Jesus went on. Instead, take the lowest place at the foot of the table. Then, when your host sees you, he will come and say, friend, we have a better place for you. Then you will be honored in front of all the other guests. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Jesus is saying, Pharisees, practice some humility. This concept that those who humble themselves will be exalted is a very common theme in Scripture, both the Old and the New Testament. In fact, that phrase is stated over a dozen different times. God delights in lifting up the humble. The book of James puts it this way: humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. It's way better to be humble in your attitudes and actions and words and have someone else lift you up than it is to be humbled by someone else, by them putting you in your place. And that's especially true if that someone else is God. Then Jesus goes on. He's still talking about humility, but with a little different spin on it. And he addresses that head Pharisee, the host of the dinner, directly. Then Jesus said to his host, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So Jesus is like, when you host a dinner like this, don't make it about status. Don't invite people who can do something for you, like improve your social standing. Now, it's not wrong, like, to have friends or family over for dinner. I mean, Jesus did that all the time. It's just nothing to write home about, nothing to be proud of. Everybody does that. It's about your motivation. He's like, instead, why don't you do this for those who can't pay you back? That's real hospitality. The best hospitality is given, not exchanged. It's what you can do for them, not what they can do for you. Okay, at this dinner, we see Jesus dealing with three seemingly unrelated topics, and there's actually a fourth that we're not even going to get into today. You got the attitude toward Sabbath rules, you got fighting over positions of importance at the dinner, and you have the motivation behind holding a dinner like that. But really, they are not unrelated. They all come back to the same root issue: selfish pride. The Pharisees had too high an opinion of themselves. They thought they were really important. They thought they were a pretty big deal, which gave them the right to look down on other people or use other people. And that's why they thought their rules should be equal to God's rules. That's why the status and prestige of having good places to sit at the dinner was so important to them. And it's why they would only invite people to those dinners who could also do something for them. Even this guy with dropsy, he was being used by them for their own selfish purposes. It all comes back to selfishness and having an inflated sense of their own importance. But the way of Jesus is not the way of selfishness. It is not the way of pride. The way of Jesus is the way of humility. And that means if we are followers of Jesus, we are also called to humility. Now, sometimes we get the wrong idea of what humility is. Humility does begin with a proper understanding of who we really are and who we are not. Like, we're not God, for example. We're not better than other people in God's eyes. We are equally in need of a Savior as everybody else. But it's also true that humility is not like looking down on yourself. It's not bad-mouthing yourself with a lot of like negative self-talk. Man, I am the worst. Like everybody else is just so much better than me, or has it so much better than me. And I just don't have what it takes. Everybody is smarter and better looking and more talented and has it all together. I am worthless. Whatever. Jesus didn't do any of that. That's not what humility is. You are not worthless. You are a deeply loved child of God if you belong to Jesus, so valuable that he was willing to die for you. But it's been said, and I agree, that true Christ-like humility isn't thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. It's a matter of focus. You're not self-absorbed. You take an interest in other people and what's best for them, not just yourself. Jesus was the ultimate model of this. He said this about himself: "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." I mean, Jesus was the Son of God, and he knew who he was. He was confident in his ability, in his identity. But his focus was on others, on other people, serving God and serving others. Paul, years later, wrote in a New Testament letter we call Philippians, an amazing passage, all about Christ's humility. He says, "Don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too." You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. That's humility. For Jesus to be God, but for him to, while he walked this earth, to voluntarily limit himself and to experience all the things that humanity experienced. He gave up some of the rights and privileges of being God so that he could accomplish his mission to save humanity for the good of others. Humility is putting the needs of others ahead of yourself. Now, this is not what our culture teaches. Our culture is highly individualistic. It is all about you. I see people boasting on social media, like just about every day, how they finally learned to put themselves first. They're like, you've got to do what's best for you, what you think is right. You've got to fight for what you want, for what you deserve. You've got to take care of yourself first. Whatever works for you, you do you, boo. That's not the way of Jesus. If you're a follower of Jesus, you're not first. You're not in first place of your life. God is first. And the needs of others are second. What did Jesus say are the two most important commands? Love God with all you are and love your neighbor as yourself. Somebody a long time ago thought of this acronym. This was actually the name of like the Sunday school class for the senior adults when I was growing up. JOY. It goes, Jesus, others, you. You know, we're called to be different than the world as followers of Jesus. We're supposed to be unique, called out. And this is one of the main ways we do that, by putting others first. Now, do not misunderstand, okay? Jesus is not saying don't take care of yourself. Don't take this to mean that you're supposed to pretend that you don't have your own needs and that they aren't important. Jesus didn't do that. Jesus rested. Jesus ate. He spent time with friends. He went to parties. He took care of his family. He took care of his relationship with God the Father. He took care of himself. Being humble does not mean we don't take care of ourselves. But where's our focus? Is it on me or is it on others? Do we use other people? Is it all about what others can do for me? What the world can do for me? What God can do for me? Or is it about what we can do for others? How God can use us to bless others and to help them and to encourage them to follow Jesus. President John F. Kennedy very famously said in his inaugural address, "Ask not what your country can do for you," in that amazing accent, "but what you can do for your country." For followers of Jesus, it's more like, ask not what your neighbor, your community, your world can do for you, but what you can do for them for the glory of God. But how do we do that? Like, what does Christ-like humility look like for us? Well, there is a lot I could say here. But it really just boils down to this. We lost an hour today. I don't have time for that. But it really just boils down to this. In light of Jesus' dinner with yet another Pharisee, instead of using people or tearing them down, find ways to build others up. That's it. That's humility. Focus on what you can do for them, how you can help them. And there are so many practical ways to do this. You guys are smart. You guys are probably already thinking of some things. Just as a short list, like when you're having a conversation with someone, instead of just waiting for your turn to talk and thinking about what you're going to say next, really listen to what they are saying. Do kind things for people anonymously, or without expecting to receive anything in return. Because if you do it just because you feel like you owe them something, or so that then they will owe you something, that's not humility. That's not the same. Jesus said, you've received your reward. Maybe it means being less concerned with your rights, your privileges, what you feel you deserve, what you feel like you paid for, and more concerned with helping others who are in need, the poor, the vulnerable, the disadvantaged. Maybe it means intentionally letting people go ahead of you. Just a simple little practice, like in traffic, or at the grocery store, like picking the longest line on purpose. Maybe it means being patient with other people when they may not understand or follow traffic laws, even if they drive a car that has a license plate from a state other than Florida. Not that we ever see that this time of year. Don't badmouth people, especially if you don't know them or what they're going through. Give them the benefit of the doubt. When you disagree with somebody, or you just don't like someone, and that's gonna happen. That's gonna happen sometimes. Still, treat them with kindness and respect. Never belittling, never dehumanizing them. You don't have to agree, and they might be wrong. But you are not more valuable than they are. Maybe it's using the resources that God has given you, like your time, your money, your stuff, to help other people. It's not just for you and your own wants. And especially use it to help those who need help. Don't do things or say things or buy things to try to impress other people. That's not the goal. Don't fish for praise or compliments from others. You know what I mean? Oh, no, I didn't really do a good job. Did I? Did I do a good job? Yeah. Don't chase the applause of people. But followers of Jesus should be the first to offer encouragement and compliments to other people. Build other people up. All that to say, in the words of Jesus, do to others as you would have them do to you. Famous words. Notice, it's not do to others if they do it to you, or do to others so that they will do it to you. Instead of using people or tearing them down, find ways to build others up. That's the way of humility. And that's the way of Christ. And make no mistake, as Jesus said, that we will be repaid. Because this life is not all there is. And our reward is in the life to come. We have hope for that life to come only through Jesus. And like I said, the ultimate demonstration of Jesus' humility was the cross. I mean, crucifixion. It was one of the most painful, humiliating deaths that people have ever, in their twisted minds, have ever come up with. But although he was the Son of God and God the Son, Jesus submitted himself to that death willingly, so that you and I could be forgiven and have hope. And one of the ways that we respond to that is with an act of humility of our own. We die to ourselves every day, and we're born again, and we follow Jesus with all that we are. Because it's not about us. We're not first. It goes Jesus, then others, then you.